Good evening, afternoon, or morning, depending upon where you are or when you're watching this. We're starting our next session. I'm Don Hester, and I'm joined by Robert DeRook. Say hi, Robert.
Hello.
And I want special thanks for Ryan for putting together the slides for us. We're continuing our series on the Security Plus certification. We're on Objective 1.4. which is to explain penetration testing concepts. And by the way, they have particular certifications for penetration testing, such as ethical hacker and PenTester. But what we're going to cover on this is kind of like the basics, what you need to know at a basic level. You need to understand exactly kind of like what is a pen test. For the exam, and the general idea of how they work, how a hacker would go through their process, or a white hat hacker trying to get into a system to exploit that system. So that's what we want to look at today. And before I get started, I just want to let you know that if you have any questions, please go ahead and fill it in the chat section. If after this presentation you have questions, you can go to our blog at www.learnsecurity.org and send us a message, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can, let you know what your answer is. And please rate us at the end. Let us know how this presentation was. Also, let us know what kind of presentations you'd like to see in the future. With that being done, part of a penetration test, Rob, and if you've ever done one of these, part of what you're trying to accomplish with that is trying to get into another system. And one of the purposes for that is it demonstrates to the organization not only do they have vulnerabilities, but that those vulnerabilities could be exploited and could get somebody into your network. And so one of the best things about a pen test is it shows you dramatically, yes, somebody can break into our system. Now, there's a lot of folks that have issues with pen tests saying, well, you know, most of the hackers aren't going to try that hard to break into your system. And that's true. Most hackers probably won't. But if you did have a motivated hacker, they may be able to expend those resources to try and break into your systems. And as a protection person or someone who's trying to defend a network or a system, we kind of want to know what the vulnerabilities are or that somebody can get into our systems so we can make sure that we're protected and then put in whatever systems we need in order to protect our systems from whatever vulnerabilities that they were able to exploit that they found. And so a pen test is basically a type of assessment. And when I say assessment, it's different than an audit because I work for an auditing firm. So when I say audit, we mean something very particular. But in general, assessment is just you're testing something. So we're testing your defenses. If we're a white hat hacker and we're coming to your system, we're going to test your defenses. Now, one of the things that is a big part of this is also it tests more than just the vulnerabilities in your system, which that's fine. You know, sometimes I don't know that you get a whole lot out of that because you can run a vulnerability scan, which we'll talk about in the next session, that can tell you what is wrong with your system and tell you all the vulnerabilities. And I almost think you want to do one of those before you do a pen test. And the reason for that is a pen test may find a way in, but they're not going to necessarily find all the vulnerabilities and report back to you all the vulnerabilities your system actually has. What you want to do is run a vulnerability scan. I would even do it as an authenticated scan, so that means the scanning device can log into the system and then get the information it needs. You get less false positives when you use an authenticated scan, and you get better detail. And you sometimes find vulnerabilities that a vulnerability scan doesn't catch necessarily if it's authenticated. So anyways, you do the authenticated scan, and then you get a really good definitive list of all of your vulnerabilities. And then you can fix all those things. Now that's what you should be doing as a part of vulnerability management. You should be going into the system, checking it on a regular basis to make sure that that your patch management process is working, right? Because in theory, if you're doing your patch management, then you shouldn't have very many vulnerabilities. Now, you may still have vulnerabilities related to configuration, zero-day vulnerabilities, and other types of vulnerabilities. Maybe something was deployed incorrectly, and maybe it's more of a configuration issue and not so much of a flaw in the software. So, but you're going to find those types of vulnerabilities too. So if your patch management's working really good, and then your configuration management and testing and deploying process is really mature and good, in theory, you can do a vulnerability scan and have a very clean report. Not a lot of stuff on it, right? Now, you do a pen test after that, then you find out, well, one, did we miss anything? And generally, you're not going to find anything that you're not going to find on the vulnerability scan. But if you had a vulnerability that was open that somebody was able to exploit, and you knew about it and you didn't fix it, well, then that's why they were able to exploit it. Now, PenTest will also try the human element of this, and they may try, and it depends upon if you engage someone to do a pen test, what level of a pen test you want them to do. In other words, they can try to use social engineering to get an employee to click on something in an email or put a USB drive into a system in order for them to get code onto the system. And yes, if you've seen Mr. Robot, they did that in one of the first or second season. They did that. That wasn't made up. That's not Hollywood. That's real stuff. Pen testers use that kind of stuff all the time. And then you're able to get into the system because somebody used that USB stick that they found in the parking lot, and they put it in there. And I always tell this story statistically, and I forgot which. It was at an RSA conference, one of the sessions in there. They said if you take a USB stick and you drop it in a parking lot outside of a company, the likelihood that somebody's going to plug that in is like, about 50% or 60%, somewhere in that range. But it jumps to 97% if you just put their company logo on the USB stick. Now, if you've ever ordered any USB sticks or you do any marketing type of stuff, you can get your logo put on anything. You just upload your logo and you tell them you want, 500 USB sticks, and they'll send them to you at $4 a piece with your logo put on it. So if you think about it, it doesn't cost a hacker very much to get a bunch of sticks, put their malware on it, drop it in your parking lot, and get like high 90% chance that somebody's going to pick it up. Now think about it. Users in the organization are going to be walking in the parking lot and they'll see their company logo on a USB stick. What are they going to assume? Somebody from my company dropped this. I should pick that up. And they're going to be curious too. They're going to be like, I wonder what's on there. And they're going to say, well, in order to find out who it belongs to, I'm going to have to plug this in order to see what it is. And maybe they're hoping to find something juicy, like, payroll information, how much does everybody get paid, or, merger information, or whatever they're trying to get. So they'll plug it in, and then that's one way they get into it. Now, a vulnerability scan is really only going to check the aspects of the system. It's not really going to check the people. So you're not going to know if the people are the weakness or the vulnerability that the pen testers can use. So pen test tests the people side of it there. The other thing a pen test tests, and this is probably one of the biggest important things, is the incident response capability. Now, depends upon how you do the pen test. If your IT staff and your incident response team or whoever you have knows that the pen test is going to happen, then you're not really testing that process, right? So the pen test really isn't doing a whole lot of good of testing how well you will respond to an incident. Now, if they don't know that it's coming, then somebody in the company has to know that it's coming, right? Like maybe the CIO or the CEO or CISO, somebody up there in the C-level suite or somebody else needs to know that this pen test is going to happen. And somebody that's in the escalation chain who would be called before somebody calls the police or something along those lines. So while the pen test is happening, they can observe and find out, if there is, to see how well they respond. How well does the organization respond to it? So a pen test, one of the benefits it has, if it's done without the knowledge of the incident responders or the IT department, is that you get to test how well they can see an active attack happening to them. Again, that's not something that a vulnerability scanner like Nessus or Qualys or any of those is going to be able to do. It can't test your operations, right? It can test the technical aspects of it, but it can't do that. So to remember, that's go back here. Vulnerability tests, vulnerability scannings or assessments can probably do a better job of figuring out what vulnerabilities you have. You probably want to start there to make sure that your systems are all locked down. But the things that those don't test is the susceptibility of people and the susceptibility of your processes, the process of, the instant response capability of your organization. So depending upon what you want to test or assess in your organization depends upon whether you want to do vulnerability or pen test there, right? I hope I cleared that up. Rob, did I clear it up? Do you have anything to add to
that? Well, just remember the key thing, that a vulnerability assessment or vulnerability scan is just going to list the potential of an exploitable item. The pen test actually goes that one step further and tells you how easy or difficult that vulnerability is to be exploited. That's the key difference.
And I would like to add on to that too, that pen tests are only as good as the pen testers. Having worked in this industry for a while and having subcontracted out to other pen testers for different assessments, you can see that there's sometimes a different quality. And there's different ways of going about pen tests. There's automated pen tests, and they have some weaknesses. One of the weaknesses of an automated one is it doesn't have the thought process of a human, the creativity aspect of it, figuring out how to exploit something. And the human aspect of it is humans are limited. So a lot of times what you'll see with a lot of pen testing is they will combine the two. They'll have the automated pen testing, and then they will have the person on top of it, or white hat hackers that would also then interpret those results and then maybe go a step further in doing the pen test.
Right. I'd like to add to that. So one of the tool sets, I guess you would say, in a pen tester's arsenal is called Metasploit. That tool's been around for a very long time. The problem now is a lot of the security appliances that corporations put into their networks for monitoring traffic, they detect all of the signatures from Metasploit attacks. So that particular tool no longer is as viable as the tool once was.
Right. And that becomes one of the things that we have to watch out for too, right? So if we have other tools that protect it, but we're kind of like poisoning the well, right? Because the tools that are meant to protect us know about the exploits, and the exploits we try to use on it, which may not necessarily be the exact same way that the hacker may use the exploit, kind of leaves us out there. And so we poison the well, and then we say, well, it doesn't work. Well, it didn't work because we already knew that was what was going to happen, so we stuck it in there. Phases of a pen test. I think one of the things that you talk about when you talk about pen tests and what you need to understand about pen tests is there has to be some planning in advance in order to determine who the target is. So you have to do, like what I call it, casing the joint, figure out who the target is, what their IP range is, what are the ways that I can try and break into the system. And then you do your discovery phase, and that's when you come in and you kind of just look at, okay, I'm going to do a ping sweep, I'm going to scan for vulnerabilities, whatever I'm going to do. Once I've determined, hey, I got all these vulnerabilities, and I'm going to attack one of those and see what happens. If I'm able to attack it and then exploit it, then I try to leapfrog from that exploit that I've made to another one. So generally, when you try to break into a system, it's a series of different hacks. You hack into one thing, you get your code onto that system, or you elevate your privileges on that system. Then you move to the next part to go in and find another vulnerability. So if you think about it, if you are on the outside of the network, you can't see too well into the inside of the network. The firewall necessarily opaques to that for you. You can't really tell what the network internally is. Generally, depends upon what they've exposed out there, right? But once you have gotten into something inside their network, then you run another scan or another discovery to find out what is in their network that you can then go from and then hop into another system, exploit some other vulnerability. A good example of this is when I run a vulnerability scan on the external facing IP addresses, the firewall side of things from the outside, I find like 50, 60 different vulnerabilities. But when I am in the DMZ, where all those boxes are behind it, I can run it and find 200 vulnerabilities. And the reason for that is because the firewall is doing its job. It's blocking stuff. So once they get past it with a piece of code, then they can do more vulnerability scanning, or however they're going to do some pen testing, whatever they're going to use for the discovery method to find other vulnerabilities, exploit those until they find something that they want, or until they're inside your network enough that they can just either dwell in there and then look for information, look for the juicy stuff that they want to get. Now, when you're doing a pen test, they're not going to stay in there for a long period of time trying to figure out what kind of information they have in there. They'll map your network. And generally, they give you a report at the end that tells you, this is what we found. Here, you can check and verify that this is what we found because we left this code on your CEO's desktop or whatever. They'll do something like that. Generally, the reporting also will include step-by-step everything they did to get into your system. You want this because you want to make sure that they're back out of your system. So you want to make sure that you can go back and get it all out. So you want an audit log that's traceable so you can see everything that they did to make sure that they're not in your system anymore. Because typically a pen tester is somebody you hire from outside the organization. And you don't want anybody in your organization, right? So even if you've hired them to do it, after the engagement's done, contract's over, you want them out, you want to make sure that they're out. So you need to have some type of audit log so you can go back and make sure they got out. But then also you can then see how they got into your system, and then you can start looking at and saying, okay, based upon this report, these findings that we have, how do we protect our system in the future from the same types of attacks in the future? So it's a learning experience, and it's kind of like a quality assurance. You know, you take the output from your assessment and you put it back into the planning process to say, okay, what do we do in the future to do this? Now, as a pen tester, you also figure out, well, how did I break into this system? So the next time you do another pen test, you can say, okay, let's shortcut things. Let's try this same thing that, you know, this is a similar client to the other ones. They have similar applications. They look like they have the same types of vulnerabilities. Let's go that same route and see what we can come up with. So both sides will use the same tools and techniques to hopefully improve their process, improve the process of doing a penetration test, improve the process of defending the systems. So this, by the way, this is coming from the NIST assessment. I forget the exact number of this, but we'll figure it out and make sure that we make notes on our slides in the future so that we tell you what NIST document to go look up for. But this one talks about the discovery phase. You know, you do your discovery, and then when you get into the attack phase, how it does this leapfrogging. You gain access to the system, you escalate your privilege, you browse the system, you install your additional tools, and then you go back and try and gain more access. You escalate your privileges. Maybe you do some additional discovery. You go through this process over and over. It's like, we used to call it leapfrogging. I don't know, do they still call it that, Rob? I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you just kind of leapfrog. Yeah, you just leapfrog your way into a system, and you go through the process of rediscovery. Just you keep on going until you get into what you're looking for. So, you want to go ahead and take this one, Rob?
Sure. Why do we pen test? Well, it's, like I said before, it validates the vulnerabilities that have been detected. Now, going back, if you look at a couple slides that Don was talking about, where you go through a planning phase. So if you're a pen tester, you've been hired out, part of that is not only figuring out what type of pen test are you actually going to do, because some organizations will not test against social engineering attacks, and some will. It really depends on the type of test, what it is that they're looking for. So when you do a pen test, part of that planning phase is gathering all that information against the target. And the target could be a single website, it could be the web server itself, it could be any servers that are sitting out in the DMZ, it could go all the way into the file server that an organization has, you know, behind several firewalls within the company. It really depends on what type of information that they're attempting to validate. So when you go through the processes of going through the pen test, the outcome is definitively to show an organization, look, you have this system, it has this vulnerability, this is the likelihood that it's going to be exploited, here's how difficult that exploit is, and here's what we did. And part of that is you, as the pen test, you're essentially being the bad guy hacker, right? They've hired you to provide these tests to give them those results so they can take that back to the security department and to the server custodians and the data custodians and say, look, here's a problem, this needs to get addressed. What kind of controls do we put in place to do that? And it could be a simple thing that, they missed a patch, or they're 2 months behind in patches, or 3 months behind in patches because they haven't gone through their testing procedures to deploy the patch, right? So this kind of puts things more in the forefront that they have to ramp up the patches in a quicker time frame, because once those things get out and the bad guy hacking community finds out that these vulnerabilities exist, those things get exploited really quickly. I can give you examples of some of the indicators, if you will, of why you should maintain patches. And this is going to go back early 2000s, and the first one is the SQL Slammer virus that ran rampant and took down all the SQL servers around the globe, including Microsoft's own. Now, the irony of this is the patch that would have stopped the SQL Slammer virus from happening was released 3 months before that virus was released. Nobody patched their SQL servers. So that's a driver that says, look, you have to keep up on your patches. If something gets listed that's critical, you need to evaluate it and apply it as soon as possible, because a short time later, you're going to have somebody exploiting that. 2 years ago, it was WannaCry and NotPetya, right? Those things came out, 6 weeks apart from each other, and they took advantage of a vulnerability that had been exposed to the public that says, SMP's got a problem. Yeah, we're working on a fix. Here's a patch. Patch didn't get deployed in most of those cases. And once it got in, just ran rampant.
I think you make a really good point about that too, and that is that not only we're touching our patch management process, but and that's a big aspect of it, right? Because like you said about some of those older ones that have happened, even some of the recent ones, there's people are worried about 0 days. I'm worried about people that don't have effective patch management, who, like you said, patch was out 2 months ago. I routinely look at scans. We do thousands of scans a year on thousands of IP addresses, and I look at them all the time. And I can tell you all the time I'm looking at stuff like obsolete software, right? That not only is it not patched, but they're using a system that is no longer supported by the vendor. So what kind of other patches or other vulnerabilities aren't in there, right? Those are the types of things you have to be careful of. Go ahead.
Yep. No, you're right. And like the last two bullets on this slide, right? The first one is the testing of the training of your employees. Yes, this goes back to pen testing, because as an example, if it's a cubed environment, right? Everybody's in cubes, and you have like hoteling space for traveling employees that come in. And if somebody manages to piggyback their way, and I say someone as in the pen tester, manages to piggyback their way through a secured area because somebody held the door open for them, and they just sat down and opened a laptop and, plugged into the network and started doing stuff, that's a pen test in and of itself, but it's also validating the training of your employees, right? Because the training of your employees should be, you shouldn't hold doors open, even if you know the person, right? Everybody needs to badge in, right? And yes, you could put in technical controls to counter that, but that should be part of your training. Also, if somebody walks by a cube that is meant for hoteling space and they see somebody there and they don't recognize that person, they need to ask them, hey, who are you? Where are you from? Let's go talk to, security or the manager or whoever. because I don't know who you are. And, you know, those are things that I've seen in a lot of situations where people just look out, you know, they're working, they get a laptop, and they just keep on going.
Well, you know, yeah, go ahead.
No, that's a very effective use of, that's the social engineering side of pen testing, but it's there to test the training methods and modalities you're using to ensure that all of your employees are familiar with them.
Right. So training is obviously one of the important things, and this is one way to test your cybersecurity awareness and cybersecurity training, that whatever your program you have, to see how mature that is and how well it's reducing your risks. So I think that's kind of one of the important aspects of it too. So the next section is about active reconnaissance, and I like to say that this is a good example of criminals, before they go in, and they don't just go rob banks. They don't just wake up one morning and say, okay, I'm going to go rob that bank, right? So they wake up, Bonnie and Clyde wake up in the morning and they say, hey, let's go rob this bank. All right, well, let's plan it out. Let's go to the bank, open an account. Let's try and, you know, figure out how the employees move, when they close things, when the safe's open, when it's closed. You know, let's kind of watch to see who's going to make large deposits. You know, so they have to, and they call this casing the joint, right? So they got to figure out what the issue is with the bank and see if they can find a weakness in the process and how everything goes. Once they've done that, then they can figure out what type of attack they want to use. So active reconnaissance is a part of that, part of casing the joint, but it goes beyond that and goes into, like, do you do a ping sweep to see, you know, the IP range that they have, what IPs are alive? They run vulnerability scans on those items to see if there's any potential vulnerabilities that can be exploited. I have a good one that's a really good one, happened to a client of mine. A lot of my clients are local governments, and I had one city that they had promoted somebody, and they made an announcement online live during a city council meeting. City council wanted to thank the person for their new appointment in the position that they've gotten. 2 weeks later or so, that person gets an email saying, hey, congratulations on your promotion. By the way, can you do this for me? And it was pretending to be from the city manager. Now, when that employee gets it, they're going to assume, oh, that must be from the city manager. I can see that it's from a Comcast email address or Yahoo or whatever email address, but it said something to me that only people that work here would know. The problem is it's online live, right? So not only is it online live, it's archived, so someone can go in and watch them after all the city council meetings are recorded so that the public can see what the city's doing. So you can go in there and watch it. So a criminal can basically case the joint by just going in and watching what they're talking about and then saying, okay, is there anything in there? Now, if they just found out that someone just got promoted to a position in finance and they're trying to get a wire transfer or something and that person's in a position to do wire transfers, then maybe they will send them an email saying, hey, congratulations on the promotion. By the way, we need to do a wire transfer right away, right? So that takes that traditional phishing attack, makes it more of a spear phishing attack, because it's very super targeted. And it's targeted based upon reconnaissance that was made on the organization. Now, this is no different than reconnaissance that you do in the military. And so everything that you think about in the military doing reconnaissance, that's the same type of stuff that they're doing. Whatever they can do, however they can get information to figure out weaknesses that they can exploit. And that's pretty much what it is. I don't know if you can add anything to that, Rob.
The other thing to add is typically when you're dealing with active reconnaissance, you're usually touching a system. So, like you said, if you're doing a ping sweep or, you know, you're telnetting into a web server on port 80 to do a banner grab, but the thing you have to realize is that it's an active event. You are going to a system or going to whatever the intended target is from your pen test and actually doing those type of scans or queries or anything. Like another example I'll give you is a website has a form that has to be filled out, right? It contains username, right? First name, last name, mailing address, something like this. An active reconnaissance at this point would be when a pen tester gets to that page, they're going to attempt an SQL injection to see if that particular site is vulnerable. And it's not that they're actually injecting any erroneous code to disable anything or delete anything within the table. What they're going to do first is to see, they're just going to throw an escape character, right? So if the page requests a first name, they'll put in their first name, an escape character, and 1 = 1, and they'll send that in. And they'll see if the page gives them an error or if the page just does nothing, right? It's blind injection. So what will happen is, if they don't get an error page, they know that particular site is now vulnerable, and then they can launch their particular attack. But in this case, that's their active reconnaissance. They've hit the page, they've sent that query, it did not generate an error, they now noted that this page is vulnerable, right?
Right.
That's an example of going from an active standpoint.
Yeah, and so I should clarify that too, because I probably didn't do a good job of clarifying. There's active and inactive reconnaissance. Active reconnaissance, we say active, it's not that the person's active, it's that they are interacting with the systems or the network or the application, whatever it is that they're doing. Where inactive is where they'd be doing like offline reconnaissance.
Right.
Some of the examples I gave you were more like the offline inactive type of reconnaissance.
Here's a more laid down, keeled version of that. So you have someone who is going to rob a house, right? Burglarize a house. So a passive or an inactive reconnaissance would be, they're going to walk down the street and look at the house to see, the lights are on, if there's people there, whatever. An active reconnaissance, they're going to go up to the front door and they're going to try the door lock, they're going to try windows, they're going to see if somebody's there, right? They'll ring the doorbell, they'll knock to see if anybody answers, and they'll come up with some excuse if somebody does, right? That's the kind of thing of the differences between an active and a passive reconnaissance.
Yeah, I like the way you put it. That makes it a little bit easier for people to understand, because that's part of what they're going to test you on. They may give you 2 examples on the exam, and then they may ask you which one's active, which one's inactive. I'm not saying that that's the type of question that you are going to get. I'm just saying that that's the type of question that they might ask. If I was writing test questions for it, I would be asking a question along those lines. And I should say that they don't. It's not. I called it inactive, but they call it passive, right? That's their word for it. And again, this is where you get into a little bit of a difference. CompTIA calls it active and passive, and when I took the CISSP a long time ago, they called it active and inactive. So anyways, so passive reconnaissance, which we kind of already talked about, those are tools that may look at traffic, because you can look at traffic and you're not interacting with the system, right? So that's like watching people come in and out of the house to figure out what time they come in, what time they go out. Maybe passive reconnaissance is watching them type in their alarm code on the outside of the house or something like that. Passive, you're not interacting with the device, you're just watching to see what communication's happening. And part of the passive one, which is the last bullet point here, is that you have to do it stealthily. You can't just stand over the guy's back and say, hey, can I watch you type your security code in, right? So that's not going to work. You need to, so even if you're on the network or you're on the outside the network or wherever you are, you set up a fake access point, you have to make sure that from the white hat hacker's perspective, that the system can't see that you're eavesdropping, so to speak. So next, getting into a system. Once you get into the system, you want to what we call pivot the system, which is that you're going to move across the system. You're going to move from one part of the system to the next part of the system. And you're going to try, like we said, the leapfrogging. You're going to try to gain access to other parts of the system from that system that you've compromised. And sometimes this can take a lot of work. Generally, once a hacker gets in, though, we tend to have a very hard shell, but a soft, mushy inner, right? We're like those Cadbury Easter eggs or whatever, right? So yep. The outside seems to be hard, but then once you get into the system, it's soft and gooey. So I've never run a vulnerability scan where the external scan was worse than the internal scan. That's never happened, all right? So So typically, internal systems, you think about it, we have this idea where we have this boundary, the firewall and all that, and everything inside of our network we're going to trust. And so we're not going to worry too much about that. The problem is once a hacker gets past that external thing, all he has to do is get past the firewall, then he can take advantage of the soft innards. So one of the things, this isn't a part of understanding PenTest, but one of the things, but it's appropriate to say it at this point in time, one of the models of security that people are pushing now is a zero trust model. And in other words, is every system doesn't trust every other system. And that is to say that basically every individual discrete system needs to have a hard shell. Everything has a hard shell. And just assume that everything else is out to get you, right? And then make sure that there's always these explicit relationships or trust between each individual device or application or layer, depending upon what it is. So this zero trust model is becoming very popular because we see that network perimeter security can be great, but once they get past it, and you see how easy it is to get past it, just drop a USB stick in the parking lot and you'll see how easy it is to get past it. So what can we do about that, right? But usually once they get in, it can be difficult, but typically it's not incredibly difficult. Now, the thing that hackers also have to do is they can't just go break into a system. Think about someone breaking into a house while you're in the house. They have to be quiet. They just can't be a smash and grab, break the windows. You know, as soon as you break the windows, it's going to tip you off that somebody's in the house, right? You're going to wake up and go downstairs and confront the whoever's breaking into your house. So if you're home, then they're going to have to be quiet when they break in. That makes it the difficult part, right? They're trying to do it without being detected. If they just break into your system and then your system goes down, then you're going to notice that something on your network's down. And it's going to be an indication that somebody's gone into. So they have to be in stealth mode, like a Klingon bird of prey, I guess. They got to go into the network, you know, with their cloaking shields up so that nobody can see them. That makes their job much more difficult. Now, yeah, so you can say, yes, smushy and easy to break in when you're inside, but you also have to be stealthy and not get caught, because that's the way the hackers are going to do it. So we have to emulate that as much as possible for that. You have anything to add to that, Rob?
Well, just realize that pivoting can be laterally and vertically, right? Like they can move from one system to another and maintain the same level of permissions, just trying to find other systems that they can then use to launch attacks with or what have you, versus the horizontal, right, where they're trying to elevate their privileges so that they can accomplish administrative required tasks, right? So just remember when you're dealing with pivoting that it can go both ways.
Right, and sometimes pivoting, they will go to a low security system, low priority system, because that might be the stepping stone to get to other higher priority system. So they can do that as well.
A good example is the IoT thermal device that was used to exfiltrate out a copy of a database, right? So the attackers connected to the IoT-based thermostat for a fish tank and then pivoted laterally within the organization to a system that then contained the information they wanted, where anybody had read access to the database and they just copied it out. So that's a good example of pivoting from one device to another, even without the requirement of an escalated privilege.
Yeah, and I think that's a perfect example of it, right? Because that's a low priority system. Everything's, you know, the thermometer on the fish tank is not going to lead to a breach, and that's what it did, right?
Yep.
And this is what I'm talking about, us being soft and squishy on the inside and having a hard outer shell, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're immune from it. So, and by the way, that was a casino, I think, that was the one that was hacked.
Yep.
And they have a lot of money and stuff. You would think that they'd spend a little bit more money on it, but they didn't know, right? Luckily, they had a defense against it, and they caught it. But how many organizations have something that's actually going to find that happening. I mean, it's beyond intrusion detection, intrusion prevention software. You need something beyond that, really, to maintain that and find out what's going on your systems. As a matter of fact, you brought up a really good point. NIST just released an IoT guidelines that they came out with, and they say, you know, one of the hardest things you're going to have with IoT is getting it into your, because that thermometer thing that we just talked about in the fish tank is an IoT device. But how do you make sure that it's a part of your inventory so that you know that that's what you need to protect, right?
Right.
And so coming up with a system, and that's one of the pain points that NIST says you're going to have with those IoT devices, is trying to get them into the other systems. Like Windows systems have a great patch management stuff, right? You have there's different ways that you can do it, but you can basically set up a server, you can set up a service in the cloud to patch your Microsoft systems. And it can be automated, and it can be almost no touch, right? Now, the problem with that is that's great for that, but what about all your other systems? So Microsoft has all this stuff built in. What about your Apple systems? What about your Cisco routers and switches, right? All those other items, when I typically do scans, I find that they're further along being not patched. In other words, they're patched between the date of the patch becoming available and when it actually gets passed is longer than it typically is with something like Windows. And that's typically because Windows has a better process for doing that. Now, some people, there's software that's out there that will kind of do all your patching for you, but there's always these applications that are not included in that. And you either have to come up with something to shoehorn them into the application that's going to do your patching, or you just have to do it manually on the other side. But you're not going to be able to do it if you don't know you have an inventory. You don't know what you have. And I'm sure the IT people were not, it wasn't on their list of inventory that they had you know, on their network was a thermostat that was in a, you know, fish tank. Maybe it was. I don't know. I don't know what that one was, but that would be an interesting question to ask them. So the next thing is persistence. Part of being white hat hackers, when you break into a system, you got to stay in the system. And we typically call that type of attack advanced persistent threats. And that is something that gets into your network and stays in your network. And there's different ways of staying into your network and trying to be stealthy and not being found. So I always think of ninjas when I think of this, right? Because ninjas, you know, they're all dressed up and they're really quiet and they really slowly sneak into some place, don't make any noise, you don't even know they're there. And then they got to hide in there for however long they have to do it. But they have to be stealthy when they're doing it. So when you think of advanced persistent threats, we're looking at statistically that some of the people that are breaking into systems, especially on small to medium-sized businesses, that they're in there over 6 months. So the hackers hack into a system, and over the period of 6 months, they go undetected. So now this creates a problem, right, for the defenders, because now you're like, you can't sleep at night because you're wondering, is anybody in our systems? And this is a very important aspect of why a pen test can really, really helpful is, did the incident response people catch it, right? You know, the sad part of the story of the fish tank was that somebody used a fish tank thermostat to break into a system. The hero of the story, though, is the fact that it was caught and that we found it, right? The fact of the matter is, how many people don't have a system in there that would catch that? Most organizations don't have that. So in that instance, somebody would have broken into the system and pivoted off of that system to break into all these other systems. It could stay there for 6+ months, right? So I don't know. Do you have anything to add to that, Rob?
No, it's that's another thing, right? Advanced persistent threats tend to linger in the environment for a very long time before they're actually detected. And I think the last number I saw was somewhere around 180, 185 days before they're actually detected. So you have to think about that. Yeah. This is an advanced persistent threat could be a backdoor rootkit, right, for remote access. So an attacker could sit there and siphon off information for 6 months, literally, not being detected. So those just kind of an example of an APT and why it's so critical that you go through these processes of doing your vulnerability scans and your penetration test to see what vulnerabilities you have and how easy or difficult it is for those to be exploited.
Yeah, and like I said, not to stress it too much, but this is one of our biggest concerns, is that are hackers in our networks, and if they are in their networks, how do we take that time period and reduce it? And part of that is figuring out, well, if they did get into it, how long would it take us to find out? Well, you can do a pen test to find out if during the pen test phase, if you can catch them. If your staff does not catch them while they're running a pen test, then your defenses are inadequate. Your incident response is inadequate. And so you have to look at that kind of stuff and figure out, okay, what are we going to do to stop this? Especially with all the craziness with all the ransomware out there. It's like every day there's a new ransomware attack. Some other company's been hit.
Here's an interesting thing about pen testing. So one of the criteria when you actually do a pen test is you're supposed to stop the pen test if you find any indicators of a compromise, because the system has already been compromised. So performing a pen test, if as an example, your security department in your organization has certain controls in place and they're monitoring everything and they're reviewing log files, but they don't detect an APT, and you scheduled a penetration test with a company, and they come in, they start doing their penetration test. If they find an indicator of compromise, meaning an APT that exists on the system, they're supposed to immediately stop and notify the organization because they've been compromised.
Well, right? Yeah, and so they don't have to do a pen test any further than that. Real life happens.
Right, because what will end up happening is the pen test itself is compromised, right? You're not getting an actual validation of what you're doing right and what you're doing wrong because the system's already been compromised.
Well, and part of that too is, again, one of the biggest things we have to do in this, and I always talk about this in this industry, is you have to think like the bad guys, right? And how do the bad guys think, you know? One, they're trying to get into your system, they're trying to lay low. They want to get into your system, figure out what you have on your system to see what they can get out of your system, for whatever their motive is. Their motive is to make money, they're going to look for ways to make money. And they're going to try and stay in your system even after they've made money, if they've made money on it, right? Let's face it, if it's a criminal enterprise and they make money, and you're basically their customer, what do they want? They want return customers, right? So if you pay ransom once, you're on the hit list for again, right? Maybe they'll give you a little bit of time so they can, you know, it's kind of like a leech, right? You can't suck all the blood out of the host, right? You got to take a little bit and then come back a little bit later, take a little bit, because otherwise you kill it, then you're not going to get anything else out of it. So you got to think like the hackers are thinking, and they're thinking, hey, if I can get in there and stay in there, then I can do this, I can do that, and then maybe I'll just lay dormant for a while, and then I'll come back later on. So all those types of things we have to kind of be careful about, that persistence, them staying in there. One of the other things we talked about is the escalation of privileges. And basically, once you get into a system, it's not enough that you just have access to the system. You need to escalate your privilege. You want to try to get root or admin privileges on the systems. Once you have root and admin, then you can do a lot of different things. And so those privileged accounts that are like admin and root that have access to sweeping levels of control within systems, once those are compromised, hackers have basically carte blanche to do anything on that system. And so we have to be very careful about those particular accounts, and we need to audit everything that those types of accounts do. And so any privileged escalations, any privileged change on a system, anything that requires admin or root to do should be logged somewhere, and that's when we talk about security, incident, and event management type of stuff. Basically, it takes all your audit logs and looks at them and determines what's there and what you should do with some of it. You want to make sure that you're watching all of that stuff to find when somebody has gotten into a system and they've escalated their privileges, or they've made changes to a system that only admins and root are supposed to be able to do. Yes, you're going to get a bunch of false positives because everything your admins are doing on a regular basis is going to end up in there. But you still want to be able to know because you want to look for the anomaly, right? You want to see that somebody has, reconfigured the system, or if somebody created a new enterprise admin in Active Directory. Probably something you want to know, because if it's not one of the people that's an admin that should have been making a new account, why was the account made? Was it an attempt of someone to escalate their privileges, right? And I just use Active Directory as an example with an account that has extremely large privileges within a domain or in a forest, right? So those are the types of accounts that we want to be very careful about. And then also just system accounts and any type of other accounts that have access to the systems, like service accounts. A lot of times we think, well, all our user accounts have changed all the passwords, but what about all your other accounts, your service accounts? Because all the services that are running may have a special account for them. Is that something that can also be exploited and then used to escalate privileges within the system? So that's our whole goal, escalate privileges until they own your network. And it happens all the time. So it's not like we're not talking theory so much. Anything to add to that, Rob?
No, that's pretty much it, spot on.
This one just talks about the initial exploitation, and basically what we're just saying is the first time you break into a system, whatever you do to get into the system, including any, will then lead to you doing any pivoting or escalating of privileges once inside the system. And again, it's part of your leapfrogging once you're in there. Test execution. Now, what's really is so important, especially if you're doing the pen test. And by the way, there's some terminology we don't talk about here. CompTIA doesn't say particularly talk about it because it's kind of a Department of Defense type of terminology, but you may hear a red team or blue team. And we say red team, they're typically the aggressors, and they're the ones that are aggressing, and the blue team is the defenders, and they're trying to defend. So in this type of what we might call a red team, blue team scenario, the red team is the pen testers, and the blue team is the incident responders. And so you're testing the incident responders, see if they can defend, and actually see that the red team is actually doing the attack. So that's just the terms that they use. You can also see the term white team, and the white team is typically like a referee who may be there with the blue team to kind of evaluate how the blue team responds, because the blue team may not know it's not real. And in that situation, the white team or the referee or the observer or the auditor is going to prevent them from calling the police or anything like that if something happens. In addition to this, if you're doing any type of physical breach of a system or of a building or a facility, there's special precautions you have to take as well, because then it's a life safety issue, because the security guard may be overly zealous and thinks you're breaking into it and will draw a gun on you. When you're doing anything, and typically another term for that you may see from time to time is a tiger team. Again, that's another Department of Defense type of terminology that we use. I think it goes all the way back to the Rainbow series way back in the day when they talked about breaching systems. But typically the physical side of things we typically call the tiger team. But it's basically a pen test too, but it's just on the physical aspects of it. And typically when you do most pen tests, when we're talking about network side of things, people are not necessarily breaking into facilities. Anyways, getting back to this, why it's really important is to document the testing procedures you're going to do. Make sure that you have a contract in place and a letter signed by somebody that's a CEO, COO, CIO, somebody like that, that says that you're going to be doing the pen test, especially if you're doing physical ones. And so that if you get caught by the security guards and they're going to arrest you and call the police, that you have that letter that you can show. Now, hackers know that too, right? So if you have that letter, it's going to have to be verified and be able to be verified by the person who signed it. So hopefully they have procedures in place within the organization, so like security guards would call before they would call the police. They'd call to try and verify that you were actually a pen tester trying to do a physical pen test. You want to document the testing procedures, like I said, as an auditor and as assessor, I have to have my results, and so that anybody comes behind me can look at my results, see how I got to my results, and come to the same conclusion that I did. So I need to document what I tested, how I tested it, when I tested it, who tested it. I need to sign off by the tester. I need to be the signer. I need to sign off that I did this test. Typically, you should have a supervisor that then verifies that they did things the way they were supposed to. They can sign off on it as well. There's usually a review process to make sure that that happens. And then once you do that, whatever findings that you have, you typically rank those findings and say, hey, you know, we found that, you know, while the technical aspects were really secure, we found that, you know, your weakest link was people, because we sent a bunch of emails and a bunch of people just clicked on stuff like crazy, right? So you would put all those things and you'd rank them by severity, you know, like what was the one thing that really got you guys in, and what was the one thing that once you were in really gave you access to everything. Those would be high-ranked systems so that the organization that had the pen test can go back and correct it. The whole point of all of this is to make our defenses better. So we need to give them a report that they can figure out what they need to do to fix so they can become better. So typically we give them a report that says, hey, this is what we found. And then we let them, you know, typically we do always a draft report, give them a draft report and say, hey, this is what our findings were. Then they can go in and say, oh, well, you know, this only did this because this is an exception because X, Y, Z. And they can put their information in, and then we finalize the report. Because sometimes, you know, IT will feel like, hey, this is an unfair test, especially if it's unannounced, right? And they're going to want to have their say in it and say, well, you know, the reason why I failed this was this, and normally we wouldn't fail, and all, you know, because they're going to feel like, oh my gosh, you know, my job is in jeopardy because we didn't catch this. It's not supposed to be like, who are we going to fire type of thing, right? It's supposed to be, how do we make ourselves better? The assumption is your incident responders are going to fail. Now, how do we better ourselves so it doesn't happen in the future, right? I think that's pretty much it. Some other types of words you may come into, types of tests that you can have. Now, if you're a pen tester, you can go in where you have no idea what's going on. We call that black box. You have no knowledge of the internal structure of the network. You have no knowledge of, if you're doing a pen test just on an application, you have no idea how the coding is coded, and you just go in. Now, sometimes that's called basic testing. NIST will call it basic testing, but it's black box testing, right? Then we have focus testing, which some people call gray box testing, and that is you have some knowledge of the internal structure or of the application, but not detailed. And then white box is very comprehensive. They have all the internal knowledge, so they can use all the internal knowledge to attempt to circumvent the controls in the system. Now, black box, the problem with the black box is that the outside people do not see all the vulnerabilities, so they don't know what all the possibilities are. And so they may find one, exploit it, and you may go fix it, but that may not fix one of the other vulnerabilities or another way that somebody can break into a system. White box, that gives them a full knowledge of the system, and you may say, well, that's not fair, though, because if you give them full knowledge of it, hackers don't have full knowledge. So now you're giving them a leg up. I feel like we should always stack it. I mean, for the test, I almost want to stack it against us, not necessarily so that we set ourselves up to fail, but to set ourselves up to improve ourselves to be better than if we just did the black box testing. That's just my personal opinion. CompTIA is not going to test you on my opinions, but I'm just telling you that my opinion would be when you're doing these types of tests, you would want to do kind of probably something along the lines of a white box test, give them as much knowledge as they can about your system so that they can, when they attack it, they can see what might actually be there, as opposed to the black box. But black box does better simulate real world incidents, but then the hackers are only going to be as good as those hackers. And there may be better hackers out there that are the bad guys who would not have the same hardship getting into your system even if it was a black box. So I almost want to give them a leg up. I don't know. What do you think about that, Rob? Again, that's just my opinion.
No, that's pretty spot on. It's just the thing with the black box is it goes back to the statement of work. What is it that you're testing for? And you have to list all those criteria, because if you're right, if they find one and they test it and it becomes vulnerable, then they give the report that says this is what we found and you go fix it. But like you said, they don't know about the others that are there. So.
Right. Before we conclude this session, a couple of different things that we need to talk about. What's the difference between a pen test and vulnerability scan, which we'll readdress next week because we're going to talk about vulnerability scanning next week. But the big thing about vulnerability scans, you're going to find vulnerabilities, and those vulnerabilities may not even be able to be exploited in order to gain access to the system or escalate privileges. In which case, is it really a vulnerability? Well, technically it is. It's a hole in the system. The system is not acting the way it's supposed to be. But maybe a hacker can figure out a way to do that. But a hacker hasn't figured it out yet, and we can't figure it out, but we know it's not right. So you find a lot of that kind of stuff that you might find in a vulnerability scan. Now, PenTest, on the other side of things, is assessing the system for vulnerabilities that can be exploited. So they're not concerned about all those other ones. They're just looking for the ones that they can exploit so that they can then try to get into the systems. And again, they may miss things. They're not going to go to every vulnerability they find and try to exploit every one of them. That's a very exhaustive, and that would be extremely expensive. It's not cost prohibitive. It's very cost prohibitive. What we want to do is try to just get into the system, demonstrate that we can get into the system, and see if the instant response, is able to catch us and respond. Kind of think of it like war games, right? You don't have to figure out every way to breach, their tank. You just have to find the one way, right? You're just looking for the one way to get into it. And then, again, we'll talk about vulnerability scanning next week. So I'm not going to get too much into it right now because that's the next session that we're going to talk about. And, there's all kinds of different vulnerability scanners. This is from an old report from Gartner, but there's new ones out there that you can find. And basically it tells you about the different vulnerability scanners. They get tested. So it's a good idea to look at the different vulnerability scanners out there to see which ones are the most accurate. There was a while ago when they were wildly inaccurate, and I would run 3 different scans from 3 different scanning machines of vendors listed on here, and you would find crazy results. Like one would find the result, another one wouldn't even say that it was a problem, and they were like real vulnerabilities. And why certain scanners miss them gets really into how the scanners actually look at the systems, and we'll have to talk about that in the next session. Just know that we actually test vulnerability scanners, and they get rated, and you want to pay attention to those ratings because the better the scanner is, the better. Some of these scanners, by the way, like Rapid7 and others, also do pen testing. They're a pen testing tool. They do scans, but they also do pen testing. So a lot of these scanning capabilities that you have, or the vulnerability scanners out there, are also tools that pen testers use. So pen testers may also use these tools. Now, what about vulnerabilities? Last thing we have to say is you need to be able to find information about vulnerabilities. There's an open source vulnerability database that's out there, the National Vulnerability Database that they have, and then how we rate those. And then there's also a database of exploits. And this is an important one to know, because if there's an exploit available and you have that vulnerability, you probably need to fix it right away, because the exploit database is what all the white hat hackers know. But guess what? That means all the bad guys know it too. So if you have any vulnerabilities that have an exploit available to them, you probably want to fix those as soon as possible, because that's basically just like, it's like taking candy from a baby, I guess. So that exploit database, that means that all the good guys know it. That means that all the bad guys also know it. Now, the bad guys know all kinds of things that the good guys don't know, because the good guys know, hopefully they're good guys, and they tell us all about it so that we can fix those holes. The bad guys aren't going to tell us about it. They try to keep all that information to themselves. Which gets back to, again, this is off topic a little bit, but we talked about the NSA stockpiling vulnerabilities that they knew about, or they were accused of doing, that they could keep those vulnerabilities by not letting the vendors know that the vulnerabilities existed, so that they could always use that as a means to get to systems in the future. So other nations are probably doing the same things, not just the NSA. So stockpiling vulnerabilities and not putting them out there is the bad guys basically saying, hey, we don't want to give this information out because we want to use it. So bad guys are going to do it, nation states are going to do it. So just because it's in the exploit database does not mean that there isn't something out there. You have anything to add to that, Rob?
No, that's pretty much it. You got to kind of stay on top of these things. And if things get reported, find ways that you can, shore up that particular vulnerability, whether it might be a rule for your IDS, IPS systems. It could be closing off a port or turning off a service or waiting for a patch to come out to update it. And once it is, make sure you update the patch. But you kind of have to keep up on the listing of vulnerabilities when they get out. A lot of those sites have mailing lists that you can sign up for, so that when a new vulnerability comes out, no matter what it's for, they'll send you an email.
Yeah, there's plenty of those out there. I'm on like 10 lists, I think.
Right, and the nice thing is most of those are not just single vendor or single OS sites, right? As an example, like the CVE, they list basically any vulnerability and exposure for anything, whether it's an operating system that's a dominant operating system like Windows or Mac or Linux, but also things like IoT devices, applications that have been installed, hardware printers, things like that, and everything in between. So it's a good way for you to stay informed on vulnerabilities that can exist.
Yep. And by the way, there's even specialized groups and specialized lists. I forget. There's one for ICS systems or OT, SCADA-based systems or operational technology type industrial control systems. There's actually a list of vulnerabilities for them that the CISA, part of Homeland Security, is posting vulnerabilities for. So they're keep up to date. If you have an ICS system, OT system, then you may want to sign up for that particular one. If you don't have it, then you probably don't care about any of those vulnerabilities because you probably don't have any of them. So there's a lot of them out there specialized as well. So that's it for our presentation. Just a reminder that this webinar can be used for continuing education, but you have to do the self-reporting, and that BrightTalk does keep track of how long you were in here. So if you need to keep track of it, you can take a thing of that. And our one slide to let you know how we pay for all this. We have services, and if you're interested in any of them, you can give us a call at Mays & Associates. And please rate this session and subscribe to our BrightTalk channel for updates and upcoming webinars. And if you want to contact us, our blog again is www.learnsecurity.org. And if you look on our Facebook or Twitter, we're posting security-related articles multiple times a day. And that's all I have. You have anything left?
Nope. That's it.
All right. Well, thank you. We'll see you next time. We'll talk about vulnerability scanning.
All right. Have a good one, everybody.